So we can just get into it. So again, we're talking about bisphenol A, or BPA, and phthalates, two types of endocrine disruptors. So we'll start with BPA, get into phthalates, and then go from there. So what is BPA? I'm sure that all of you remember probably like 10 years ago when there was this big push to remove BPA from reusable water bottles. So I remember, I think I was in middle school or something, walking around with my water bottle that said BPA free. And so it's kind of all coming full circle because now, it's becoming, or still is, a problem in consumer goods, drinking water, and so on and so forth. So again, it's a chemical that's used in a bunch of consumer goods, and also several types of plastics. So that includes, food containers, cash receipts is another place where BPA is included, and then canned foods. So that's kind of the one that is most commonly known. It's just used in the lining of canned foods. So again, BPA is an endocrine disruptor, so it's particularly harmful for pregnant mothers and babies. So yeah, you probably remember that big push for BPA free, and these like consumables and bottled water companies actually use it as a marketing tool. So what they did is they figured out an alternative to BPA that, the whole story goes, you find an alternative that isn't really tested, and then that's kind of put into the public, into the environment, and then 10 years down the road, we realized that the replacement for the chemical was actually just as bad. So anyways, these reusable water bottle companies were using the fact that they found a replacement for BPA as a marketing tool, and they would put, BPA free on water bottles. So the most shocking thing about BPA is that it's not currently banned at the federal level. So that BPA free push was actually a voluntary thing that these companies decided to do, and it actually benefited them because they were able to use that as a marketing tool. So the only kind of like federal action on BPA was from the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and they banned BPA from baby bottles and sippy cups in 2012. So that's really the only federal action. Certain states might have, acceptable levels or guidance, or they might require disclosure. If a consumable has BPA in it, they might be required to put it on the label. But that's really it. And that's really shocking, because I think when that whole push to have plastics be BPA free, people thought, oh, this is because it's banned, and that's actually not the case. It was just a voluntary phase out, or a voluntary change in the plastic that they were using. So that kind of covers BPA in terms of consumer goods. So what about drinking water? And the good news about this is that people are typically exposed to BPA through foods. So when we're talking about BPA in drinking water, it's not entirely it's not the biggest route of exposure. So when people are exposed to BPA through drinking water, it's typically because of like a landfill that wasn't properly lined, or there was some damage to the lining. And there's a bunch of different types of plastics in the landfill, and then that would leach into a drinking water supply. That's pretty much the only major exposure route of BPA. So that's kind of what we need to be concerned with in terms of drinking water. I will say that one of the downfalls to this is that BPA is not regularly tested. Because it's not regulated in drinking water, there's no reason for municipalities to test for it. And that kind of doesn't really give us the whole scope of the problem in drinking water. So that's definitely a limitation with BPA in drinking water, is that it's just not really tested for. It's not really something that we fully know if it's present, I should say. So then just kind of in terms of if you're listening to this and you want to learn more about BPA, there's a great TED Talk called Toxic Baby. And it's actually this woman who created a film basically talking about her experience with pregnancy and how they actually tested her blood and everything and found really high levels of BPA. And so she kind of decided to make a movie about it. But the TED Talk Toxic Baby, it's about like 15 minutes long. I linked it in our bio. It is super interesting. I highly recommend watching it. You'll learn a lot about plastic producers, and then how BPA can impact our bodies. So that's the sum of BPA. So now let's kind of move on to phthalates. So phthalates are chemicals that are added to PVC pipes, polyvinyl chloride, and other types of plastics. Phthalates are actually also in some cosmetics, which is pretty terrifying, wood varnishes, and even some medical supplies. And this really comes down to the fact that phthalates were actually very useful. They're a great thing to be added to plastic. They make it malleable, and that's really why they're so widespread, is because they're really, really useful in terms of thanks, Eric, in terms of being in plastic. That being said, they are of course under that umbrella of endocrine disruptors, so impacting hormonal functions, reproductive outcomes, and that's kind of the benefit cost analysis, if you will, of phthalates. So similar to BPA, people are typically exposed to phthalates through food consumption. If something was wrapped in plastic that contained phthalates, or containers, but similar to BPA, not really widely tested in drinking water. So this is kind of that similar situation where we're able to say, all right, phthalates are super problematic in drinking water, but that's just because they're not really being tested for. And so one of the reasons for this is because there are so many different variations of phthalates in the environment and just being used in consumer products. So similar to what I said with BPA is that chemical and plastic producers will find this really great alternative to phthalates, or a different variation of phthalates, or BPA, or whatever it is. They'll find this really great alternative, go with that for about a few years until they find the next best thing. But all of those other previous iterations are in the environment. They're already out there for us to kind of deal with after companies already moved on and started producing with some other type of plastic. So that's really where the biggest issue arises. And if you've been following us or listening to these Instagram lives, you're probably thinking, this sounds very familiar. It sounds kind of like what's going on with PFAS, is that PFAS or forever chemicals, is that producers will, again, thanks, Matt, will just kind of keep creating the next best thing after so many other variations have already been put into the environment. So phthalates, PFAS, this happens all the time with any sort of chemical, really. So With all of those different variations of phthalates, you might be surprised to learn that only one is regulated in drinking water. So again, we don't really know the entire story with phthalates because only one is required to be tested for. There are dozens in the environment, dozens that are being produced on a daily basis. So it's also kind of one of those things where just because consumables are the primary route of exposure doesn't mean that it's not in our drinking water. It's just not being tested for. So I also want to talk about a really specific, not really specific, but a specific example of how phthalates can directly affect drinking water. So as I said earlier, phthalates are found in PVC and other types of plastic pipes. And so the first time I really started to pay attention with this topic was I was actually in California for those just like terrible wildfires that happened last fall. And the New York Times actually wrote this piece about the plastic pipes and actually how they can contribute to the drinking water contamination from the wildfire. So it's not just that like debris or the slurry from trying to put out the fires. Like there's a whole other side of it that isn't really largely reported. And so basically these researchers in California tested municipal and private water supplies after the big fires and found elevated levels of phthalates, and were kind of confused as to why this was happening. Ultimately determined that the PVC pipes that were being used in distribution systems and in homes that were used to kind of either replace the lead pipes, or they were just used in new construction, that those pipes were actually leaching phthalates into the drinking water. And so they can leach much easier when they are heated. So it's kind of the same reason why my mom at least would always tell me, don't put plastic containers in the microwave, because those chemicals can leach much easier when they are heated. And the same story happened with these pipes in California. So I just thought it was super interesting. And really the first time that anyone has ever paid attention to this. And especially, I think it's especially important to mention as the US is kind of going through this transition of lead pipes to what is the alternative. Like maybe it's not PVC based on this recent study. So yeah, a lot to unpack, but hopefully this was kind of helpful. Just kind of highlighting two endocrine disruptors that we get a ton of questions about through our chat and email. So if you have any questions about BPA, phthalates, any other endocrine disruptors, we have a team of scientists ready to answer your questions. So if you go to hydroviv.com, you can take advantage of our live chat function and ask away, because we are happy to inform people about these chemicals that can seem really scary and intimidating. And yeah, we're here to help. So you can DM us, you can email us at hello@hydroviv.com, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. Again, check out the Toxic Baby link in our bio for some really great information on BPAs. It's an awesome TED Talk. I highly recommend it. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye!